Well, welcome. It is really, really nice to see you all here. And, you know, it's really the one opportunity in the year that I have to say thank you to you, because we really are very, very grateful to how you support us all through the year with all kinds of uses that we make with your donations. But of course, the biggest one, and the one that we are most grateful for, is the support to our postgrads. And the opportunity that we have to have new PhD students coming through, to be carrying through, and in some cases to just finish in their 3 years with a flourish. So thank you very, very much for that. And we celebrate by having Jack tell you about his PhD. So Jack, as I say, took 3 years. He was working on the journal Die Weltbühne, which probably most of you know about. It was a really important journal in the interwar period. First really started as what it sounds like, Weltbühne, so a kind of review paper, and then became a very important sort of liberal left-wing political paper as well. And people have looked at it under several angles before, but there is no real sort of comprehensive study of the Weltbühne. And Jack has now applied this idea of patriotism to this left-wing journal, where at first you might say, really, you know, patriotism and these, you know, definitely not traditionalist writers, but that's exactly the point, you know, to really find out, aren't there several ways, aren't there other ways of expressing patriotism? So that's what he's dedicated his PhD to, and we'll hear more about it, which is great. I just want to say that Jack has finished his Viva or done his Viva in February, so it's really very new. And no corrections. The PhD went through without any corrections. And on the back of it, because people, not just us, but other people as well, recognize the importance of it. So on the back of it, he's also won an MHRA scholarship to finish a monograph based on the PhD. I don't think an awful lot has to be done because it's already there, but you'll take your time over it, I'm sure. So that's great. So here I am introducing Jack, and very much looking forward to your talk. We'll have the opportunity to ask questions afterwards, and then I'd like to invite you over to next door to have a glass of wine with us. And now over to Jack.
Well, thank you, Godla. I think I should probably quit while I'm ahead, really, shouldn't I? I'd just like to start by echoing Godla's thanks to you all for the opportunity you've given me to do my PhD. It really has been very enriching and a lot of fun. But I'll crack on. Say the word patriotism to many people of a broadly liberal persuasion today, and you can usually bank on a certain kind of reaction. A nervous little smile, a polite furrowing of the brow, and oddest of all, the hint of a blush. If I had to translate this reflex into words, it would go something like this. Is this person entirely safe? Am I safe? Is it good for me to be seen in public with them? The instinctive distrust of patriotism in bien-pensant circles is not a 21st century phenomenon, nor is it the child of globalization or the digital age. Those with cosmopolitan pretensions have, not entirely unreasonably, been suspicious of patriotism for as long as there has been such a thing as a patria. I think here of the at once deliciously funny and deeply poignant point in Heine's Deutschland ein Wintermärchen, Germany a Winter's Tale, written in 1844, at which the narrator feels compelled to justify his return home to Germany 13 years into his elective exile. And I've got my own translation up there, so you have to forgive me for there not being any rhymes in it. That's something he does rather well, but I'll read it in German because, needless to say, it's a lot better in German. Ich sehnte mich nach den Plätzen sogar, nach jenen Leidensstationen, wo ich geschleppt das Jugendkreuz und meine Dornenkronen. Ich wollte weinen, wo ich einst geweint die bittersten Tränen. Ich glaube, Vaterlandsliebe nennt man dieses törichte Sehnen. Ich spreche nicht gern davon, es ist nur eine Krankheit im Grunde. Beschämten Gemütes verberge ich stets dem Publiko meine Wunde. Heine, who had fled Germany to escape the overzealous censorship laws and would later support the 1848 revolutions, was nobody's jingoist. He was the last person to gloss over Germany's shortcomings or to curry favor in the court of public opinion with ostentatious declarations of national loyalty, as the next stanza shows. And again, the previous apology applies. Fatal ist mir das Lumpenpack, das die Herzen zu rühren, den Patriotismus trägt zur Schau mit allen seinen Geschwüren. Heine then was all too aware of the trap into which admissions of tender feeling for one's country can lure you. I use the word admission advisedly, as the narrator's Vaterlandsliebe is, lest we forget, a guilty secret he prefers not to discuss. Indeed, a sickness he conceals from the public gaze. But why? Well, for one thing, Heine is evidently wary of being associated with a certain kind of patriot, the political provocateur whose motives are nefarious and whose sentiments are in any case skin deep. For another, there is the political system, of which any declaration of love for Germany might be construed as signalling approval. Heine's Germany, it need hardly be said, was a patchwork of principalities under the control of an assortment of dynasties which ruled without any democratic legitimacy. He was a radical socialist. In the Wintermärchen, incidentally, there is a wonderful scene in which the narrator comes face to face with King Barbarossa, or later Emperor Barbarossa, in his Kyffhäuser fastness, and persists in addressing him with the familiar du, in spite of Barbarossa's gruff injunctions. Last but not least, there is the baggage that patriotism was thought to bring with it. Heine's lifetime had seen the invasion of Germany by Napoleon's France, followed by the so-called Befreiungskriege, or wars of liberation. Anti-French feeling, unsurprisingly, ran high for years afterwards. Indeed, in his prose work on the history of religion and philosophy in Germany, Heine claims to have overheard a countryman of his in a tavern swearing vengeance on the French for the beheading of the 13th century Hohenstaufen pretender to the Sicilian throne. If this anecdote is to be believed, to be a proud German was synonymous in the crasser reaches of the popular imagination with disliking the French. Patriotism, and it is patriotism from which Heine expressly wishes to distance himself, appears to represent one side of an unedifying coin, xenophobia the other. The inner conflict that plagued Heine did not die with him. After drifting around for several decades in search of a suitable host, it finally lighted upon a man whom his contemporaries, Kurt Hiller and Arnold Zweig, to name but two, thought of as the great man's natural successor, Kurt Tucholsky. Tucholsky was, of course, the animating spirit behind the weekly left-wing journal Die Weltbühne, and it just so happens to be this publication that I came here today to talk to you about. I ought to put my cards on the table nice and early and own that explicit declarations of patriotism in Die Weltbühne were few and far between. As usual, Tucholsky's own qualms on this score can be taken as broadly representative of the prevailing tendency in the journal. a rule of thumb whose general validity is rooted in the fact that Tucholsky and his 4 pseudonyms contributed some 1,552 articles in the interwar period. Few other authors' contributions even ran into the hundreds. Like Heine before him, Tucholsky always felt uniquely repelled by the word patriotism. And in this respect, an article of his that appeared in the Weltbühne in 1926 is an instructive place to start. In this piece, titled Next Door in the Pigsty, Tucholsky harks back to a poem by theatre critic Julius Bab called Deutschland and published in the journal in 1919. Here, Bab had ridiculed the recurring question, do you love Germany? Insisting that his ingrained bond with Germany went much deeper than the give and take of love, and demanding, can I love my hair, my blood, myself? Writing 7 years later, Tucholsky takes up this rhetorical question and recommends that it be thrown back in the face of anyone with the temerity to ask if you love your Heimat. Note that Bab does indeed address his country as Heimat, a word that in the pre-Hitler age still retained some vestige of Salonfähigkeit, even apolitical overtones outside nationalist circles. Having quoted Bab's rejoinder, and got hair and blood the wrong way round, incidentally, Tucholsky adds with venomous feeling that if he asks you whether you're a patriot, then box him around the ears. Patriotism as a label was clearly beyond the pale for Tucholsky, and it remains so for the rest of his short life. In a 1930 essay called Heimat, he returns to this distinction, declaring, we are content to be outdone in our patriotism by anybody, in our love for the Heimat by nobody. Once again, we find ourselves before the question of what it was about the word patriot that got Heine Tucholsky's hackles up when each of them was prepared to profess their love for Germany, be it in the form of Vaterlandsliebe or of Heimatliebe. To answer this, it's revealing to compare the times in which these two writers lived. Granted, on the face of it, they probably seem to be poles apart. What, for example, have Republican democracy and autocratic rule got in common? What, for that matter, do a loosely connected confederation of dominions and a single centralized state have to do with one another? On closer inspection, however, 2 major similarities suggest themselves. The first is the unsettled climate of Francophobic resentment. In both cases, Germany was smarting from the humiliation of having been recently overpowered by their Western neighbor, with the result that German identity had come to be defined in some quarters in opposition to its erstwhile French adversary. For those untroubled by revanchist impulses, some of whom, perish the thought, even had reconciliation on the mind, vociferous patriotism was consequently tainted by association. The second thing that linked Heine's Germany to Tucholsky's was, at least in their own hearts, the ambivalence with which the prevailing state apparatus could not fail to inspire them. We know Heine's objection to the way 19th century Germany was run. So let's turn without further ado to Die Weltbühne's attitude to the Weimar Republic. And at this juncture, I must ask, the shades of 1960s Weltbühne scholarship are probably floating somewhere up there in the ether to hold their peace, because I've no wish to rehearse a tired old argument that you often hear, that left-wing journals such as this one were in effect, if not in intent, anti-Republican, that they contributed to the downfall of Germany's first democracy by discrediting it in the eyes even of the favorably disposed. The truth about the Weltbühne's Republican credentials is that they never wavered, and it is for that precise reason that the journal was a thorn in the Republic's side. The crux of their dissatisfaction with the Republican experiment was that the journal's stalwarts believed it to be a continuation of the Kaiserreich under a different name. The same judges still presided over the nation's courthouses, gleefully handing down draconian sentences to a disproportionately high number of alleged left-wing offenders and letting off the vast majority of right-wing plotters, including a healthy portion of bona fide assassins and would-be assassins, virtually scot-free. The same conservative civil servants lingered on in the rebranded offices of government, dripping their class hatred into lawmakers' ears. The schools and universities were awash with war apologists, desperate to report free-thinking teachers and lecturers who dared to tell their young charges the truth about life on the front line, or acquaint them with such dangerous concepts as international law. This was the miserable context in which Tucholsky, ever the spokesperson for the Weltbühne stable, had written the article Wir Negativen, a withering riposte to the charge that he and his colleagues were professional doom-mongers who refused to see the good in their country. The abiding image of this piece, which was written as early as 1919 and gave its name to a posthumous collection of Tucholsky's work, is his defiant evocation of Germany's moral nadir. You have it here in English. Again, my translation, not a patch on Tucholsky's original, which goes like this. Damit wir in der Welt geachtet werden, müssen wir zunächst zu Haus gründlich reinmachen. Beschmutzen wir unser eigenes Nest? Aber einen Augiersstall kann man nicht beschmutzen. Und es ist widersinnig, sich auf das zerfallene Dach einer alten Schreiner zu stellen und da oben die Nationalhymne ertönen zu lassen. In other, much drearier words, mouthing patriotic platitudes about the greatness of Germany would have been an act of egregious hypocrisy when the Weltbühne found the Weimar state wanting on so many levels. For as long as Tucholsky and his fellow naysayers identified patriotism with celebrating the anticlimax of the Weimar Republic, the word would remain toxic. Then how, I hear you cry, did you manage to write a 90,000-word thesis on patriotism in the Weltbühne? Well, the answer is simple, albeit not as simple as it might first appear. The writers of Die Weltbühne were in love with an ideal. This ideal was largely predicated on a vision of a future Germany unencumbered by revisionist resentment and bogus nostalgia. One of the most frequently recurring appeals to be heard in the Weltbühne was that for a nationwide moralische Abrüstung, moral disarmament. Any such psychological demobilization or cultural demobilization, as the historian Benjamin Siemann calls it in his study of Republican patriotism, would go beyond simply accepting that Germany had lost the war fair and square and committing to abide by the heavy territorial and financial losses inflicted by the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain-en-Laye. What it ultimately amounted to was the demand that the Democratic Republic finally lay the ghost of the Kaiserreich by disowning the war of aggression that had been waged in Germany's name by a disgraced imperial regime. Put another way, what was at stake was nothing less than the credibility of Germany's democratic revolution. The writers of Die Weltbühne had a point, you'd be pleased to know. It wasn't just that successive Weimar governments insisted on haggling over the terms of the peace treaties, nor that noted authority Richard Grelling had been excluded from a committee tasked with establishing which nation was culpable for the outbreak of the First World War, precisely because he had written a forensically researched book laying out the considerable extent of Germany's own responsibility. No, the hangover from the Wilhelmine era was much more pervasive. Thus, in 1922, Otto Flake wondered aloud in a Weltbühne series entitled Deutsche Reden, the title an unsubtle allusion to Fichte's Reden an die Deutsche Nation, how any self-respecting democratic state could tolerate the celebration with full pomp and circumstance of the 40th birthday of the ex-Crown Prince Wilhelm at a Potsdam barracks. Whether, for that matter, it was possible to take seriously the iconoclastic intentions of a regime that conducted its parliamentary business in the shadow of a statue of the Kaiser. And what, finally, It said about the sincerity of the Weimar leadership's democratic convictions that it still insisted on retaining the anniversary of the proclamation of the Kaiserreich as its national holiday. But there was a chink in the Weltbühne writers' armor, their own sentimentality. The shrunken German state in which they now lived may have been an indictment of imperial overreach, but that did not make it any less regrettable to Arnold Zweig, for example, that the Upper Silesia in which he had grown up was now Polish. Nor could Tucholsky simply shrug his shoulders at the confirmation that the Kurland, a large plain on the Baltic coast, once settled and presided over by German nobility, would never again belong to Germany, but would henceforth form part of the new Latvian state. Both wax lyrical about the German history of these regions. In the case of the industrial heartland of Upper Silesia, Zweig was practically spitting feathers that Germany's loss should be Poland's gain. The Polish claim, he raged, was, quote, neither naturally nor morally tenable, close quote. Flake, for his part, lamented the concession to Slovenia, the formerly Austrian province of Styria, seeming to regard Austrian lands as an extension of a Großdeutschland, a greater Germany, that had been disfigured against the wishes of its inhabitants. Now, all this might have been grist to the mill of the nationalist right, if the journal hadn't resisted the temptation to point the finger at the rapacious allies, and instead resolutely maintained that Germany had brought its fate upon itself by allowing itself to be hijacked by a bellicose Prussian elite that had thoroughly traduced the true essence of Germany, the perennially elusive Deutschtum. The Weltbühne's patriotic prescription for a prosperous Germany was dictated by where its columnists believed this ideal Deutschtum to lie. In the pages of the Weltbühne, then, there was no shortage of emotional fervour and superstition to go with all the cool circumspection for which the journal was otherwise known. Some of this, as I've already hinted, was ostensibly provincial in nature, with Wilhelm Michel, who hailed from the Palatinate region, staking the claim of his fellow Pfälzer to be considered more loyal than any other German community to what he called the warm, nourishing nucleus of Deutschtum. A year before this article appeared, in 1922, Michel had also written a pamphlet with a stirring title, Verrat am Deutschtum, in which anti-Semitism was denounced as the eponymous national betrayal. Otto Flake gave it a glowing review in the journal. Michel was one of the journal's most eloquent exponents of what I have termed regionalist patriotism, a scattered miscellany of contributions spanning poetry, prose, and polemic that sought to articulate a nuanced, personalized, and quietly defiant definition of German identity that was independent of, indeed aloof from, the power political machinations of the Prussian elite. But the argument in Michel's pamphlet that intolerance was somehow intrinsically un-German, indeed that, quote, to feel German means embracing all things, questions, people, suns, and planets with an enormous love force, close quote, also hints at one of the other two predominant patriotic trends in the Weltbühne. If the journal's regionalist patriotism, as I show in the first chapter of my thesis, consisted of complicating the notion of what it meant to be German by expanding its meaning beyond the merely Prussian, the paper was unequivocal in its belief that Germany's destiny depended on the patriotic pursuit of internationalism. And none other is the subject of the second chapter of my thesis. Being an internationalist, a woolly term, if ever there was one, is often equated with being somehow anti-national. That is to say, at best indifferent to your nation's fortunes, and at worst actively hostile to them, the opposite, indeed, of a patriot. My case study of Die Weltbühne gives the lie to this lazy elision of internationalism and treachery, not least because many of its writers saw it as nothing less than Germany's historical mission to play an exemplary role on the world stage, to which, after all, as Godler indicated in her introduction, the journal owes its name, Die Weltbühne. Germany's preordained destiny, they claimed, was to lead the world away from the thorny path of mutually assured destruction on which the First World War had been merely the latest staging post, and into the sunlit uplands of a future without weapons. This was the Macht in Ohnmacht, or power in impotence, thesis, and it was a perfect fit for Germany's newly diminished status. The argument ran that losing the war and seeing its army slashed to 100,000 men had given Germany a head start in the race to the top of an embryonic post-war world order in which dialogue and not shows of force would set the tone. The reliably portentous Otto Flake proclaimed that defeat on the battlefield had turned Germany into, quote, the first Heimat of the Zukunftsidee, the idea of the future, for which read pacifism. While Weltbühne leader writer Karl Rothammer, who was actually a staunch social democrat in spite of his name, penned two columns to the effect that demilitarization had paved the way for, quote, a new kind of German world power, close quote. And the fascinating figure of Helena Kessler von Mombach, better known under the pseudonym of novelist Hans von Kahlenberg, rhapsodized in messianic tones about a, quote, German renewal of the world and her country's, quote, infinitely great historical task, by which she meant the realization of international socialism, of which more in a moment. Taken as a whole, then, the Weltbühne's internationalism was a curious concoction. To the inattentive reader, its pacifism might appear to be the dominant note, and with good reason. The firebrand pacifist intellectual Kurt Hiller avowed in the journal's last ever issue that it was a matter of national honor to refuse to take up arms for your country in order to protect another nation's sovereignty. Back in 1925, meanwhile, Tucholsky had wistfully noted the absence of statues in honor of pacifist martyrs, pondering the baleful undertow of war memorials in a passage that begins with the darkly ambiguous clause, hands swearing vengeance, rise up out of German marble. Is he referring there to soldiers or to pacifists? However, alongside and in concert with such effusions of patriotic pacifism, an intriguingly elastic concept that is gaining in currency since its coinage by Sandy E. Cooper a little over 30 years ago, Die Weltbühne bullishly endorsed an exalted view of Germany as a trailblazing moral force in a post-war world crying out for a fresh start. Germany's redemption was not a fait accompli. The image of a moral and existential abyss haunted not a few of the journal's warnings to its readers. What was required was moral disarmament, the real thing, and with it, Germany's return to global preeminence would follow. The third and final pillar of the Weltbühne's patriotic edifice was socialism. After a brief flirtation with radicalism in the early months of the Weimar Republic's lifespan, the journal largely distanced itself from revolutionary agitation, though hard left sentiment made a reappearance in the mid-1920s in the form of Alfons Steiniger, who would go on to co-author the Constitution of the German Democratic Republic. His parting shot was to suggest that Germany subordinate itself to the Soviet Union in the shared struggle against American-style capitalism. But this was a gesture of despair that found scant to no resonance in a journal otherwise bent on promoting the solidarity of the laboring and professional classes, as both an urgently needed antidote to domestic civil unrest and a historical inevitability inscribed in the tortuous evolution of the German nation. In 1921, Otto Lehmann-Russbult, a veteran peace activist revered in pacifist circles, went so far as to assert that he had always understood Deutschtum, that old chestnut again, to mean manliness and independence. Before drawing a line from the expulsion of Napoleon through the failed democratic revolution of 1848 to the ill-conceived entry into the First World War, in an attempt to refute what he called the colossal Deutschnational con of civil subservience. For all that they rested on a selective reading of history, these words would have fallen on fertile soil in the wake of the Kapp Putsch of March 1920. This reactionary coup, the work of a disorganized band of decommissioned soldiers and mercenaries, spearheaded by the monarchist civil servant Wolfgang Kapp, was smothered in its infancy by a general strike of blue and white collar workers, prompting Die Weltbühne, in the voice of long-serving Social Democratic Party moderate Heinrich Ströbel, to hail it as the moment that Republican consciousness dawned on the German people. Quite apart from its historical echoes, invoking the power of a mythologized common people against the destructive and self-serving forces of the anti-democratic hard right was also seen as a matter of national self-preservation in the Weltbühne. This imagined cross-class constituency, whose mouthpiece certain contributors to the journal evidently considered themselves to be, was frequently celebrated as das schaffende Volk, literally the productive people. Most strikingly, in a lengthy 1925 report by a reformed paramilitary officer, Karl Mertens, who railed against the hypocritical patriotism of the so-called Vaterländischen Verbände in the name of the civilian population whom these illicit regiments allegedly held in contempt. To the same extent that armed rightist violence, masquerading as solemn patriotic duty, was perceived to be a homegrown threat to the fledgling republic, the nationalists' irredentist rhetoric was regarded as inviting trouble from without, especially during the Ruhr crisis of 1923-5. Many Weltbühne columnists lived in constant low-level fear of permanent French colonization. They therefore felt that it was of paramount importance to challenge the claim in right-wing newspapers and elsewhere that German workers in the Ruhrgebiet were burning to rise up against the occupation, just in case French leaders got it into their head to exploit this version of events as a pretext for annexing the right bank of the Rhine for good. To this end, the Weltbühne even published a letter in the summer of 1923 in which an anonymous worker claimed that those workers who wanted to rid themselves of the French occupiers by giving them what they wanted had, quote, more Vaterlandsliebe in their little fingers, close quote, than all the architects of the German government's passive resistance policy put together. If proof were ever needed that the Weltbühne saw itself as the tribune of the much vaunted productive people, this was it. Patriotism in the Weltbühne was the love that dared not speak its name, a passion imprisoned within the reticence of a group of writers whose distaste for the unreconstructed nationalism of their right-wing contemporaries had sullied the word patriotism irrevocably. Yet Heine's foolish yearning lies barely concealed beneath the surface of the regionalism, the internationalism, and the socialism expounded in the journal's pages. Like Heine's narrator, when the homesickness first comes upon him, Kurt Tucholsky and his fellows longed for a land momentarily out of reach, a country that resided partly in their rose-tinted memory and partly in their imagination. But the last word must go to Tucholsky, that latter-day Heine, without whom Die Weltbühne would have been, apart from anything else, a great deal shorter. I invite you here to play a game of Where's Wally with this Georg Gross painting as I read out to you in conclusion what Tucholsky had to say in an essay of his written in 1930 called Heimat. It's not true that those who call themselves national, while being nothing other than bourgeois militants, have annexed this land and its language for themselves. Germany is not just the government representative in his frock. nor the school teacher, nor the gentlemen and ladies of the Stahlhelm Veterans Association. We are still here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. I am in awe how you were able to to condense your, I don't know how many words it was, 80,000, 100,000, you know, how you were able to condense that into this very incisive, very clear talk. Extremely well done. I will ask the first question and then I'll open the floor. The question I'd like to ask is really about those three pillars that you've identified: the regionalist patriotism, internationalist patriotism, and socialist patriotism. When I hear you speak about the Weltbühne, I think, well, yes, you know, that's obvious. That's you know, that's such a clear representation of what there is. But of course, when you read the Weltbühne, you have this amorphous mass. And it is not, you know, you were talking about the paper does this, the paper pulled in all kinds of directions, didn't it? So this this success of yours to identify these three columns is something you mustn't, you know, you really should celebrate, because that is amazing. I wanted to ask whether you were ever tempted during the writing of the thesis to go for did you identify other pillars? Were there other overriding categories that didn't quite make it into your three-pillar structure?
I seem to remember I came to it fairly early on. It sort of crystallized in front of me. I always knew, I think, that I mean, by definition, it's a left-wing journal. So I think I was always going to talk about socialism, and I wanted to talk about socialism in such a way that I wasn't simply prating on about doctrine. I was actually applying it to their relationship with Germany. So that was a given. The internationalism, I think, was also probably not far behind, because it was a product of its time and its milieu. It was a paper that swung very early behind pacifism. Pacifism being probably the main demand really of the internationalist discourse at that time. And the Weltbühne was quite unusual among German papers in that it didn't become rabidly pro-war upon the outbreak of war in 1914, partly perhaps because it had been a theatre review before then, so it didn't have a sort of clear political identity. But then the more I read, the more interested I became in the very intimate conceptions of Germany that you encounter. That's where regionalism came in, of course. There were all sorts of pieces that seem to speak to an understanding of the writer's German identity that often kicked out against stereotypes of sort of martial Prussian might. And it was a challenge sometimes to sort of read between the lines and see how this reflected on the nation as a whole. But in the end, I think that became rather the point of the exercise. It was tricky to tease out those common national threads, precisely because they were making actually quite a bold point when you take them all together, about what Germany comprised.
No other contenders then? Good.
I think not.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Sorry, I'm totally ignorant. I've never heard of that interpretation and really interested in the clear, concise, and perfect. My question is, when did it start? When was it closed? And if the editors, throughout the life of the publication, it was a monthly or weekly, did the editors gave the publication different stamps of their own, either ideology or personality?
I'm glad you asked that, because now I can talk a bit about the personalities behind it. It started in 1905 as this theatre review, and it was called Die Schaubühne. So it was...
Theater in Berlin.
Yeah.
It's a theater that's called Schaubühne.
A specific theatre,
Yeah,
right. Yeah. Right. Oh, see there, I'm learning stuff. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, well into the Weimar period, it had a hefty section of its journal, of its coverage was given over to theatre. They had writers like Alfred Polgar, for example. So it was quite prestigious in that field as well. It was founded by Siegfried Jakobson in 1905 in the wake of a controversy. He was accused of plagiarism. I have to try and recall the details, but I think it was a book he'd written about the theatre. And it was found that he had actually lifted vast chunks of another critic's writing. And he claimed, and there's perhaps I'm biased, but there's no reason necessarily to disbelieve him, that he was so immersed in his topic that he'd unconsciously internalized these things. But anyway, he became a bit of an outcast as a result from the journalistic community. And so really the only option he had left was to make his own. And he was a very, by all accounts, a very rigorous editor. Tucholsky was, I think, one of the very few writers whom he actually trusted. I mean, even in the early days, he would go through his stuff with a red pen. But Jakobson died in 1926, and I mean, Tucholsky was absolutely distraught, and he's written quite moving poems that have been set to music, actually, about Jakobson. And there's a wonderful image of the morning after Jakobson's death, when Tucholsky takes over the Weltbühne, and really against his will. And he's sitting in his old office, and somebody comes in, I forget who, one of the writers, and he finds Tucholsky quite distractedly scribbling little stick men on a piece of otherwise blank paper, and sort of staring into the middle distance, disconsolate, and also, I feel, perhaps projecting his own kind of self-understanding onto the paper. He didn't see himself as up to the task, and quite rightly so, because he wasn't a leader of men. He was a brilliant, astute, hilariously funny, and caustic observer of events, who needed a free rein. And within a few months, he handed the reins over to Karl von Ossietzky, who would later win the Peace Prize. And Ossietzky was the opposite of Tucholsky, regarded as a bit of a cold fish, but he's also hero worshipped by a lot of people, not just in the Weltbühne circle, because he was a very principled man, and he was taken to court, I think, on at least 2 occasions. In the end, he's interned, and he eventually died in captivity during the Nazi regime. But he was regarded as sort of the ultimate incorruptible journalist who spoke truth to power. And then once the Nazis took over, and of course the Weltbühne went into exile. I had a bit of a peripatetic existence, and ended up. First of all, it was in Vienna, and then Prague. It was taken over ultimately by Hermann Wojciechowski, who had been extremely minor. He only written a couple of pieces for the Weltbühne, but he did a bit of a dodgy deal, by the sounds of it, with I think it was Siegfried Jakobsen's widow, to basically buy the paper outright, but he moved it much closer to the Orthodox Comintern line, and indeed after the Second World War, when it was reborn yet again as the Neue Weltbühne, it did become a sort of glorified organ of the GDR state. So it's a bit of a sad end, really. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Wondering, with regard to the concept of patriotism that was invested in the Weltbühne, whether there was an interaction with, on the one hand, say, Karl Kraus in Austria, but on the other hand, various people in France and Switzerland who were already formulating the sort of ideas that led to the European Union, to the Second World War. People like Kalergi, various people in France.
Yeah, I mean, very much so is a short answer. Coudenhove-Kalergi was, I think, an object of fascination for some of the writers, although I think they were, and this is perhaps the tension, I suppose, with the internationalist ideals and the reluctance to kind of separate themselves from their idea of Germany. I think the pan-Europe idea was regarded with a lot of skepticism, while at the same time, appearing to actually answer a lot of, say, Tucholsky's prayers. I mean, he was quite wary of pan-Europe, but he also wrote a piece in which he conjures up this wonderful image of there being a warehouse of nation states in the after the First World War. Obviously, couldn't quite get his head around all these many peoples wanting their own state, wanting self-determination. So that was the sort of the proto-EU idea was there, and there was lots of there was cooperation with the French. The French pacifist movement. There was a guy called Felix Stössinger, who was actually he had edited the USPD, the Independent Social Democrat newspaper, earlier in the decade. But he came on board with the Weltbühne, and he wrote this fascinating series called Was ist uns Frankreich? What's France to us? And at the end of it, he published the Weltbühne published a joint statement by the French and German leagues for human rights, essentially calling for reconciliation, for rapprochement. So the idea of France, and actually in many ways the ideal of France, was I think uppermost in a lot of their minds. Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to say thank you again. It really
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you.